The golden afternoon light of late September lay warm and tranquil across the manicured lawns of St. Mary Mead, burnishing the church of St. Mary, in the Vile, to a soft, honeyed glow. It was the day of the annual parish fete, an event looked forward to with quiet anticipation by every resident from the vicarage to the smallest cottage on High Street. Bunting fluttered cheerfully in the gentle autumn breeze, strips of red, white, and blue snapping against the backdrop of ancient oaks and neatly trimmed hedges. At the center of the green, Colonel Bantry stood proudly beside the cake stall, his formidable moustache bristling as he enthusiastically debated the merits of Mrs. Clitheroe's gooseberry jam with a decidedly overwhelmed curate. Nearby, Miss Jane Marple sat comfortably in a wicker armchair beneath the welcome shade of a sprawling beech tree, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically in her lap like the reassuring tick of a grandfather clock. A soft fleece shawl was draped across her shoulders, and a pair of silver-rimmed spectacles rested delicately on the bridge of her nose. To anyone passing by, she was the picture of a harmless, elderly gentlewoman entirely absorbed in domestic tranquility. Yet, beneath her placid exterior, Miss Marple's pale blue eyes observed everything. She noted how young Dr. Carmichael's hands trembled slightly as he poured tea for Mrs. Proudfoot, and how the wealthy newcomer, Mr. Arthur Pendleton, cast an anxious, calculating glance toward the vestry door every few minutes. Human nature, Miss Marple often maintained, was remarkably consistent whether one lived in a bustling metropolis or a secluded English hamlet. People, she believed, were fundamentally the same everywhere, prone to jealousy, ambition, and the occasional desperate folly. The festive atmosphere reached its crescendo precisely at 3 o'clock, the traditional hour when the heavy bronze bell in the church tower was rung to officially open the afternoon games. All heads turned upward toward the stout stone tower as the sexton, old Thomas, was expected to pull the thick hemp rope. Instead of the deep, resonant toll that the village had known for generations, a sudden, strangled metallic clatter echoed from above, followed instantly by a heavy, ominous thud that reverberated through the turf beneath the villagers' feet. A breathless hush fell over the green. The laughter ceased. The fluttering bunting seemed to freeze in the stilling air, and Colonel Bantry stopped mid-sentence regarding his gooseberry preserves. Moments later, a sharp scream pierced the silence. Young Elsie, the vicar's housemaid, came stumbling out of the low arched doorway of the church tower, her face stark white, clutching her apron to her mouth. "In the belfry," she gasped, her voice trembling uncontrollably as she pointed a shaking finger toward the dark stone entrance. "Oh, please, it's Mr. Pendleton, and he's not ringing the bell." A wave of cold dread rippled through the sunlit gathering, as the local constable, a flustered young man named Higgins, pushed his way hurriedly through the paralyzed crowd. Miss Marple calmly set her knitting down in her lap, smoothed the skirt of her dark tweed dress, and let out a quiet, thoughtful sigh. Soar, the tranquility of St. Mary Mead was shattered as effectively as a dropped teacup on a flagstone floor. In an instant, the cheerful hum of the parish fete dissolved into a chaotic swirl of gasps, hurried whispers, and panicked movement. Colonel Bantry was the first to recover his physical composure, though his face flushed a deep, apoplectic purple as he barked orders at the bewildered onlookers. "Stand back, everyone. Give the constable room, will you?" the colonel demanded, striding heavily toward the church porch with his walking stick raised like a standard. "Higgins, what on earth are you dawdling for? Get in there and take charge." Constable Higgins, a young man whose ambition vastly outstripped his practical experience in homicide or even serious misdemeanor, swallowed hard. He adjusted his helmet with a shaky hand and disappeared into the cool, cavernous shadows of the church porch, followed closely by the Reverend Julian and a reluctant Dr. Carmichael. Outside on the sunlit green, the village reacted with the swift, predictable polarization characteristic of tight-knit rural communities. Within minutes, small huddles formed around the periphery of the refreshment stalls, buzzing like disturbed hornets. "Murder, I tell you," whispered Mrs. Price Ridley, clutching her handbag to her chest as though an assassin might leap from the nearby hydrangeas at any second. Her eyes darted excitedly from face to face. "It's as plain as the nose on your face. And him such a charming gentleman, too. Always wearing those immaculate linen suits and tipping his hat to the vicar's wife. But I always said, didn't I, Mrs. Clitheroe, that anyone who arrives in St. Mary Mead with a locked trunk and no visible relatives is bound to end up on the wrong side of the law. Nonsense, Ada, snapped Mrs. Clitheroe, whose pride in her gooseberry jam had been utterly eclipsed by the local catastrophe. Mr. Pendleton was a patron of the arts, or so he claimed. He gave a most generous subscription toward the church roof restoration just last month. One doesn't murder a benefactor. Though, mind you, I did notice the man had a peculiar habit of burning his letters in the small brick incinerator behind his cottage. My gardener saw him doing it twice last Tuesday. As theories fermented and multiplied like wild yeast, the atmosphere grew increasingly feverish. By the time Constable Higgins backed out of the church doorway, looking distinctly green about the gills, the entire village was locked in a fierce debate over whether Arthur Pendleton had been struck down by a foreign spy, a jealous husband, or a curse related to the antique Persian rug he had recently acquired from a dealer in London. Miss Jane Marple remained seated beneath the sprawling beech tree. She had not joined the frantic huddles, nor had she rushed toward the church porch. Instead, she picked up her knitting once more, her needles moving with a steady, soothing cadence. Yet her pale blue eyes were entirely focused on the fringes of the crowd. She watched young Dr. Carmichael as he emerged from the church, wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief. She noted how his eyes immediately sought out Miss Evelyn Vance, the local art teacher, who stood rigidly beside the bookstall. Miss Vance did not gasp, nor did she press forward with the rest of the morbidly curious villagers. Instead, her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of the wooden table, and her gaze was fixed fixedly on the toes of her sensible brown walking shoes. "Poor Mr. Pendleton," murmured a gentle voice beside Miss Marple. It was Griselda Clement, the vicar's young and lively wife, who had slipped quietly into the wicker chair next to the older woman. Griselda looked pale and troubled. "Julian is inside with the constable now. It's truly dreadful, Jane. To happen right here during the fete, with all the children about. Do you think it was an accident? Perhaps he slipped on the steep belfry stairs?" Miss Marple paused her knitting, resting her hands softly in her lap. She looked toward the medieval stone tower, then back to the vibrant, terrified faces of her neighbors. "Accidents, my dear Griselda, do occasionally happen," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft and carrying an innocuous, gentle, melodic quality that completely masked the razor-sharp intellect behind it. "People trip over loose carpets or stumble on garden hoses every day of the week, but a heavy iron ring pull striking a man squarely from behind while the midday bell is silent, that, I am afraid, sounds far less like an accident and far more like a very deliberate piece of choreography." Griselda shivered despite the warm afternoon air. "You make it sound so cold, Jane." "Human nature is never cold, my dear," Miss Marple said mildly, picking up her grey wool again. "It is uncomfortably warm, impulsive, and terribly complicated, which is precisely why people go to such extraordinary lengths to hide their tracks." Across the green, Constable Higgins raised a megaphone and stammered a request for everyone to please return to their homes while the authorities secured the area. But as the villagers reluctantly began to disperse, carrying their gossip and frightened theories with them, Miss Marple knew that the true unraveling of St. Mary Mead's darkest secret had only just begun. By Monday morning, the tranquil atmosphere of St. Mary Mead had been thoroughly overshadowed by an oppressive cloud of suspicion and whispered speculation. The local post office and the butcher's shop served as unofficial tribunals where every resident weighed in on the sudden demise of Arthur Pendleton. Yet, while the rest of the village buzzed with breathless theories of international espionage and hidden fortunes, the official investigation plodded forward with characteristic bureaucratic rigidity. Inspector Slack of the county constabulary had arrived by 9 o'clock in a gleaming black Wolseley, his large frame and booming voice instantly dominating the peaceful vicarage parlor where he had set up his temporary headquarters. Slack was a man who believed in loud voices, heavy boots, and the comforting certainty of a signed confession obtained through sheer intimidation. "Clear-cut case of robbery gone wrong, Reverend Clement," Inspector Slack declared loudly, slapping his leather notebook against his thigh as he paced across the Persian rug. "Fellow has a nice house on the edge of the village, expensive cufflinks, a gold pocket watch. Though oddly enough, the watch was still in his waistcoat pocket. Never mind that. The point is, strangers moving into quiet country villages always attract the worst sort of criminal element. Pendleton was living above his means or hiding from someone. We find the person he was meeting in secret on Friday night, and we wrap this whole business up by Tuesday afternoon." The Reverend Julian Clement offered a polite, skeptical nod from behind his mahogany desk, while his wife Griselda perched on the arm of a chintz sofa, looking thoroughly unconvinced. "I hardly think Mr. Pendleton was living a double life of international crime, Inspector," Griselda remarked lightly, leaning forward. "He spent most of his afternoons tending to his prize-winning dahlias and complaining about the dampness in the church vestry, hardly the work of a master criminal." "Appearances, Mrs. Clement, are notoriously deceptive," Slack retorted with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Criminals don't walk around with placards around their necks. Now, where is that elderly lady the vicar mentioned? Miss Marple, is it?" The vicar suggested she might have some observations to share regarding the comings and goings near the church tower. At that precise moment, the front parlor door clicked open, and Miss Jane Marple stepped into the room with quiet grace. She wore her familiar winter-weight tweed coat despite the mild September air, and carried her knitting bag neatly looped over her arm. "Good morning, Inspector Slack," Miss Marple said, her voice carrying a sweet, unassuming clarity that caused the burly inspector to turn around rather abruptly. "I do hope I am not intruding. Griselda mentioned that you were looking into the tragic affair at the Belfry, and having lived in St. Mary Mead for the better part of my life, I thought perhaps my humble recollections of the village routine might be of some small assistance." Inspector Slack stared at the elderly woman with a mixture of patronizing indulgence and thinly veiled annoyance. He had little patience for elderly spinsters who fancied themselves amateur sleuths, believing that detective work was strictly a matter for heavy boots, fingerprints, and blunt interrogation. "Well, Miss Marple," Slack said, adopting a deliberately condescending tone, as though explaining a simple ledger to a child, "we appreciate your community spirit, I'm sure, but we are dealing with a hard-boiled homicide here. We've established that the victim was struck from behind with a heavy iron lever used for the secondary church bells. It's a straightforward violent entry, unless you happen to see a masked ruffian scaling the stone ivy outside the belfry at 3 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. I'm afraid there isn't much an observer from a garden chair can tell us." Miss Marple smiled mildly, her pale blue eyes twinkling with a gentle, disarming warmth as she seated herself near the window. "Oh no, Inspector, I certainly saw no masked ruffians," Miss Marple replied softly, smoothing her skirt as she settled into the armchair. "Masks are so terribly impractical in broad daylight, don't you think? They draw far too much attention. One would look quite absurd walking down High Street in a balaclava. No, the person who entered the church tower on Saturday afternoon did not look like a criminal at all. In fact, they looked entirely ordinary, quite as ordinary as the curate delivering parish notices or the milkman dropping off his morning pints." Inspector Slack paused, his pencil hovering over his open notebook. He frowned, his bushy eyebrows drawing together over a heavily furrowed brow. "What do you mean by that, Miss Marple? Are you saying you saw someone go into the belfry just before the bell was supposed to ring?" "Not precisely into the belfry itself, Inspector, though I did happen to notice certain patterns of behavior that perhaps escaped the more scientific notice of your officers," Miss Marple said gently, pulling a ball of soft grey wool from her bag. Her knitting needles began their rhythmic, soothing click-clack. "For instance, I noticed that young Dr. Carmichael walked past the Lyche Gate toward the rectory path at precisely 2 minutes to 3, carrying his medical bag. Yet, when the heavy thud echoed from the tower moments later, Dr. Carmichael was the very first person to sprint around from the opposite side of the vestry wall, holding an empty teacup he had clearly just retrieved from the refreshment marquee." Inspector Slack blinked, briefly thrown off balance by the precision of the observation. "A doctor fetching tea. That hardly constitutes a suspicious movement, Miss Marple. People drink tea at fetes. It's an English tradition." "Quite so, Inspector," Miss Marple agreed amiably, her needles never missing a beat. "Tea is indeed a wonderful tradition. But Dr. Carmichael does not drink black tea without milk, yet the cup he carried back to the table was half filled with dark, unadulterated infusion, the exact sort poured by Mrs. Clitheroe at the perimeter table where Mr. Pendleton had been standing only 10 minutes prior." The room fell into a profound silence. Reverend Clement raised his eyebrows in quiet astonishment, while Griselda offered a subtle, knowing smile. Inspector Slack, however, cleared his throat loudly, visibly uncomfortable with the notion that an elderly lady sitting under a beech tree might have perceived a subtle inconsistency that his own uniformed constables had entirely overlooked. "Coincidences happen every day, Miss Marple," Slack insisted, though his voice lacked its previous booming confidence. "A doctor can pick up the wrong cup in a crowd. It's hardly proof of foul play in a homicide investigation." "Of course it isn't proof, Inspector," Miss Marple murmured softly, her eyes fixed peacefully on her steadily growing row of grey stitches. "Proof requires fingerprints, timetables, and medical examinations. But human nature, as I so often remind myself, never changes. When a man takes extraordinary pains to alter his usual route, or to be seen carrying an object that does not belong to him at the precise moment a tragedy occurs, it is rarely due to mere coincidence. It is usually because he is desperately trying to establish a narrative that shields him from the uncomfortable truth." Inspector Slack stared at her for a long moment, struggling to find a suitable retort. Before he could speak, however, a sharp knock at the parlor door interrupted them, and Constable Higgins rushed into the room, holding a crumpled, damp sheet of paper that would entirely shift the direction of the investigation. The arrival of Constable Higgins with the crumpled, damp sheet of paper brought an abrupt halt to Inspector Slack's patronizing dismissal of Miss Marple's observations. The constable's boots clattered awkwardly against the polished wooden floorboards as he hurried toward the center of the vicarage parlor, his face flushed with the nervous excitement of a man eager to prove his worth to a formidable superior. "Inspector, sir," Higgins gasped, holding out the wrinkled document like a trophy. "We found this tucked deep inside the dry stone wall behind the church vestry, just a few paces from where Mr. Pendleton's walking stick was recovered. It looks like a hurried note, partially torn but legible enough." Inspector Slack snatched the paper from the young constable's hand with an impatient grunt, smoothing the creases across his knee. The room grew still, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway suddenly sounding loud and intrusive against the heavy silence. "Read it aloud, Inspector, if you please," the Reverend Julian Clement requested quietly, leaning forward from his desk with a furrowed brow. Slack cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the bold, jagged ink strokes. "If you do not return the ledger by Tuesday, I shall have no choice but to lay the entire matter before Colonel Bantry and the parish council. Your little arrangement in London cannot stay buried forever." Slack paused, his brow darkening into a formidable scowl. He looked up, casting a triumphant glance around the room. "Well, there you have it. Extortion. Someone in this village was bleeding Pendleton dry, and when he refused to pay any longer, they silenced him permanently." "A very dramatic interpretation, Inspector," Griselda Clement murmured softly from the sofa, her arms crossed over her light cardigan. "Though blackmail strikes me as rather exhausting work for anyone living in St. Mary Mead. Who on earth in our village would have the stomach for such villainy?" "Anyone who stands to lose their social standing or their livelihood," Slack retorted sharply, standing up and beginning his heavy-footed pacing once more. "And as it happens, our primary suspect has already made herself remarkably conspicuous by her absence from the village inquiry this morning." All eyes turned toward the inspector. "Miss Evelyn Vance," Slack declared, tapping the damp note with a thick index finger. "The art teacher who lives in the stone cottage down by the rectory lane. According to several reliable witnesses, Pendleton and Miss Vance had a fierce, shouting argument behind the parish hall last Wednesday evening. Witnesses heard words about an account and a stolen portfolio. Furthermore, Miss Vance's handwriting bears a striking resemblance to the jagged slant of the letters on this note. Miss Jane Marple did not look up from her knitting, though her needles paused for a fraction of a second before resuming their steady, rhythmic click. "Evelyn Vance is a most conscientious young woman," Miss Marple remarked mildly, her voice like a soft chime beneath the inspector's booming declarations. "She paints exquisite watercolors of English wildflowers and devotes countless hours to organizing the children's drawing classes. It is difficult to picture her engaged in a dark web of financial extortion. People with gentle hobbies are often the most desperate when their secrets are threatened, Miss Marple," Slack countered with a dismissive wave of his hand. We found a collection of old correspondence in Miss Vance's desk drawer during our brief preliminary inspection of her cottage this morning. Letters addressed from an art gallery in Chelsea, bearing Arthur Pendleton's signature. They indicate a bitter business dispute dating back nearly 5 years, involving thousands of pounds in missing commissions. The Reverend Clement frowned deeply, clearly disturbed by the swiftness with which the investigation was narrowing its focus. Evelyn Vance has lived among us for 4 years, Inspector. She is quiet, reserved, and keeps very much to herself, but that is a far cry from cold-blooded murder. Quiet people often harbor the loudest grievances, Reverend, Slack insisted, already marching toward the parlor door with Constable Higgins trailing close behind. I'm bringing her in for formal questioning at the station house. The evidence is mounting by the hour, and frankly, this case is wrapping up much faster than I anticipated. With a brisk nod and a self-satisfied smirk, the inspector strode out of the vicarage, his heavy boots echoing down the gravel path outside. When the front door slammed shut, the parlor seemed to exhale a collective breath. Griselda turned immediately toward the elderly woman sitting by the window, her expression laced with genuine concern. "Jane, you don't really believe Evelyn did it, do you?" Inspector Slack is entirely convinced, but he always chases the most obvious shadow in the room. Miss Marple set her knitting down in her wicker bag with delicate precision. She smoothed her tweed skirt and looked out the window, watching the black Wolseley car kick up a small cloud of white dust as it sped down the lane toward the village green. "Inspector Slack is a most energetic man," Miss Marple observed softly, a faint, knowing smile touching the corners of her lips. "He possesses a wonderful enthusiasm for handcuffs, signed warrants, and neatly typed confession forms. But he suffers from a common masculine affliction. He is far too dazzled by the loud noise of a falling tree to notice the quiet, steady roots rotting away beneath the surface." "You think Evelyn is innocent, then?" Griselda asked eagerly. "Evelyn Vance is certainly hiding something, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her pale blue eyes reflecting a sharp, piercing clarity. "People who are entirely innocent do not grip the edge of a table until their knuckles turn white, nor do they burn old letters in their garden incinerators at midnight. But being terrified of a scandal is quite different from being a murderer." The note Slack found in the stone wall. It was too neat, too conveniently placed for a hurried criminal. "Conveniently placed?" Reverend Clement echoed, rising from his desk. "You mean someone planted it to frame her?" "Or perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, taking up her grey wool once more as her needles began to click with renewed purpose, "to direct the village's attention precisely where the real killer wishes it to remain. When a magician performs a trick, my dear Reverend, he always tells you to watch his right hand while his left hand is performing the real sleight of hand." By Tuesday afternoon, the arrest of Evelyn Vance had thrown St. Mary Mead into a state of agitated disbelief. While Mrs. Price Ridley and her circle of gossips at the post office declared that they had known all along there was something peculiar about an art teacher who kept her windows shuttered past 9 o'clock. A quieter, more uneasy sentiment rippled through the sensible residents of the parish. The village was small enough that everyone's habits were common knowledge, and the sudden removal of a familiar, soft-spoken face left a palpable void in the daily rhythm of the high street. Miss Jane Marple, however, remained entirely unswayed by the general consensus. While Inspector Slack congratulated himself in the local station house over a solved case, Miss Marple was quietly pursuing a line of inquiry that required neither warrants nor handcuffs, but merely a pair of sharp eyes and a deep, unshakable knowledge of human nature. The opportunity presented itself shortly after 2 o'clock, when the autumn sun broke warmly through the pale clouds, casting long shadows across the vicarage lawn. Armed with her garden basket, a pair of small pruning shears, and her knitting bag, Miss Marple strolled at a leisurely, unhurried pace down the narrow gravel path that led past the church vestry toward the old stone belfry tower. The heavy oak door of the belfry had been sealed with official red wax by Constable Higgins following the tragedy, but the small, low-slung coal cellar window situated around the side of the stone buttress remained unsealed and partially ajar. It was an awkward, narrow aperture used decades ago for hauling winter fuel into the crypt beneath the floorboards, a space most able-bodied adults would find far too cramped to navigate. Yet, as Miss Marple paused near the overgrown boxwood hedge, her pale blue eyes noticed a tiny, seemingly insignificant detail that had escaped the hasty search of the local constabulary. Caught upon the jagged edge of the rusted iron window latch was a microscopic shred of bright daffodil yellow wool. Miss Marple approached the stone wall with measured grace. She adjusted her silver-rimmed spectacles, bent down with surprising agility for a woman of her years, and gently extricated the tiny yellow fiber using the tip of her pruning shears. She held it up to the autumn sunlight, turning it over between her wrinkled fingers. It was an uncommon wool, not the coarse grey tweed of the villagers or the sturdy brown wool worn by the local tradesmen, but a fine, imported merino yarn, dyed a brilliant, cheerful shade of sunshine yellow. "How very extraordinary," Miss Marple murmured softly to herself, a faint, knowing smile touching her lips. Daffodil yellow in late September. One simply does not see that particular shade of yarn in St. Mary Mead at this time of year. Unless, of course, someone with a distinct preference for bright, cheerful garments has been paying clandestine visits to a very dark and dusty corner of the church. As she slipped the yellow fiber carefully into a small cellophane envelope tucked inside her handbag, a sharp rustling sound echoed from the nearby shrubbery. Miss Marple turned quietly to find old Thomas, the parish sexton, standing by the vestry door with a large wooden toolbox clutched tightly in his gnarled hands. The old man looked nervous. His pale, watery eyes darted away from Miss Marple's direct gaze, and his knuckles were tightly clamped around the iron handle of his box. "Good afternoon, Thomas," Miss Marple said cheerfully, her voice as sweet and disarming as a summer breeze. "A lovely afternoon for gardening, though the autumn leaves are beginning to fall rather thickly around the churchyard, aren't they?" "Aye, miss, they are," the old sexton muttered, shuffling his heavy boots awkwardly against the gravel. He cleared his throat, casting a sidelong glance toward the sealed belfry door. "Terrible business, this. The police think they've got the art teacher locked up tight, and good riddance, I say. Strangers bringing all sorts of trouble into a peaceful parish." "Indeed, Thomas," Miss Marple agreed mildly, stepping a fraction closer while keeping her expression entirely benign. "It is always sad when people succumb to greed or desperation. Though, looking back on Saturday afternoon, I was just wondering, you were the one who unlocked the main belfry door at precisely 10 minutes to 3, weren't you? To prepare the ropes for the celebratory bell ringing." Thomas stiffened noticeably, his shoulders hunching up toward his ears. "I opened the door, aye, per instructions from the vicar, and then I went down to the tool shed to fetch the oil can. Everyone knows the bronze clapper needs a drop of grease every fortnight, or it makes a terrible metallic screech instead of a proper chime." "Of course it does," Miss Marple said, nodding sympathetically. "A squeaky bell is quite distressing for a parish fete. But how very fortunate that you happened to leave the inner door unlatched while you went to the shed. Otherwise, whoever slipped into the tower to wait for poor Mr. Pendleton might have found themselves locked out in the open courtyard." The old sexton's breath hitched. A faint sheen of perspiration appeared across his wrinkled forehead, despite the cool autumn air. "I didn't leave no doors unlatched, miss. The wind plays tricks with those old oak hinges. Always has, ever since I was a boy." "The wind is a remarkably convenient excuse, Thomas," Miss Marple remarked softly, her pale blue eyes locking onto the old man's shifting gaze with a sudden razor-sharp intensity that completely belied her gentle demeanor. "Just as a bright yellow woolen cardigan is remarkably difficult to conceal when one is hiding in a dark, narrow stone tower designed for shadows." Thomas recoiled as though he had been physically struck, his hands trembling violently around the wooden toolbox. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he swallowed hard, turned on his heel, and hurried away toward the rectory garden with surprising speed, leaving Miss Marple standing alone in the quiet churchyard. Miss Marple watched him retreat with a quiet, contemplative sigh. She retrieved her knitting bag from the grass, looped it over her arm, and began the slow, thoughtful walk back toward the vicarage. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with the precision of a well-rehearsed clockwork mechanism. Yet she knew that human nature being what it was, the true test of the mystery would require not just exposing the evidence, but observing how the real culprit reacted when backed into an inescapable corner. By Wednesday morning, the atmosphere in St. Mary Mead had shifted from stunned disbelief to a low, simmering tension that seemed to permeate every corner of the village. The initial shock of Arthur Pendleton's murder had given way to the uncomfortable reality that one of their own neighbors was living under a cloud of deep, dark deception. While Inspector Slack remained smugly confident that Evelyn Vance's arrest would soon yield a signed confession, the more observant residents of the parish sensed that the investigation had merely scratched the surface of a much older and more complex web of secrets. At the vicarage, the breakfast table was uncharacteristically quiet. The Reverend Julian Clement stared moodily into his teacup, while Griselda paced restlessly by the bay window, watching the damp autumn mist roll across the lawn. "It simply doesn't make sense, Jane," Griselda burst out, turning abruptly to face Miss Marple, who sat by the hearth calmly buttering a piece of dry toast. "Evelyn Vance is locked away in the county holding cell, yet the entire village feels as though it's sitting on top of a powder keg. Yesterday at the butcher's shop, Mrs. Price Ridley was whispering about old scandals involving Arthur Pendleton and an art gallery in London 5 years ago. Apparently Pendleton wasn't just a quiet gentleman of leisure. He was mixed up in a rather unsavory business involving forged paintings and blackmail." Miss Marple chewed her toast slowly, her pale blue eyes reflecting a quiet, contemplative light. "Forged paintings, my dear Griselda. People in quiet country villages are often terribly romantic about art. They imagine galleries in London or Paris filled with bohemian artists and aristocratic patrons, forgetting that greed and dishonesty exist just as easily behind a canvas as they do behind a ledger or a village grocery counter. Inspector Slack is convinced the motive was financial extortion," the Reverend Clement noted, setting his teacup down with a faint clink. "He claims Pendleton was threatening to expose someone who helped him fence those forged works back in London before he retired to St. Mary Mead. But Slack is looking exclusively at Evelyn because of that awkward correspondence found in her desk." "Inspector Slack," Miss Marple observed mildly, picking up her knitting bag, "possesses the wonderful childlike faith that documents always tell the complete truth. Documents, my dear Reverend, can be forged, misplaced, or deliberately left in drawers for inquisitive eyes to find. Human beings, however, their habits, their hidden resentments, and their desperate attempts to protect long-buried scandals tell a far more truthful story." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple decided that the time had come to test the waters of village opinion directly. She took her wicker shopping basket and strolled down High Street, stopping first at the post office and stationery shop, which served as the primary exchange for local intelligence. As she entered, the sharp chatter of Mrs. Price Ridley and Mrs. Clitheroe ceased instantly, replaced by a conspiratorial hush. "Ah, Miss Marple." Mrs. Price Ridley greeted her with a breathless, eager lilt, stepping forward as though imparting state secrets. "Have you heard the latest? They say the police found a second letter hidden in the vestry wall, not just about money, but about a woman. Some scandal from 20 years ago involving a wealthy family in Chelsea. Poor Mr. Pendleton was blackmailing half of London before he settled here. How very exhausting for him," Miss Marple remarked in her softest, most innocent tone, selecting a spool of cream-colored darning thread from the wire display rack. "I have always maintained, Mrs. Price Ridley, that maintaining a double life requires a prodigious amount of stamina. Most people are far too lazy for it. They prefer quiet lives, until, of course, their past mistakes come back to demand an accounting." Mrs. Clitheroe frowned, leaning against the counter. "Well, whatever his past was, someone in St. Mary Mead knew about it. Why else would he be struck down in the belfry just as the parish fete was beginning? It wasn't a random vagrant, it was someone who wanted him silenced permanently." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, paying the shopkeeper the exact change for her thread. "Someone who perhaps feared that his peaceful retirement in our lovely village was about to be terribly disrupted by old ghosts." Leaving the post office, Miss Marple did not return immediately to the vicarage. Instead, she took the narrow, winding path that led past the back of the parish hall toward the secluded stone cottage rented by Dr. Carmichael. The doctor's practice was quiet today, the brass plaque on his gate gleaming dully in the afternoon overcast. As she approached the low wooden gate, she noticed the side window of the surgery standing slightly ajar. Through the opening, she caught the faint, unmistakable scent of burning paper drifting from a small brick incinerator located in the narrow alleyway behind the garden shed. Miss Marple paused by the gate, her knitting bag looped over her arm. She remembered the shred of bright, sunshine yellow merino wool she had discovered trapped on the coal cellar window latch near the belfry. She remembered old Thomas's nervous shuffling and Dr. Carmichael's hurried return from the marquee with a cup of dark, unadulterated tea at precisely 3 on Saturday afternoon. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected quietly to herself, was profoundly predictable when cornered. People who believed their secrets were safe would go to extraordinary lengths to protect them, even if it meant letting an innocent art teacher take the blame for a murder she never committed. She gently pushed the gate open, her footsteps falling soft and silent on the gravel pathway, ready to set the final, delicate stage of her psychological game. The afternoon mist was beginning to thicken into a heavy, damp shroud that clung to the ancient stones of St. Mary Mead, casting long, melancholy shadows across the vicarage lawn. Inside the cozy warmth of the study, the fire crackled in the grate, yet an unmistakable chill hung in the air, a tension born not of the autumn weather, but of the unsettling realization that the village's fragile peace had been permanently fractured. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window in her familiar wicker armchair, her knitting needles clicking with a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Across the room, the Reverend Julian Clement paced restlessly near his bookshelves, while Griselda sat on the chintz sofa, staring blankly into the dancing flames. "I still cannot believe Inspector Slack is moving forward with formal charges against Evelyn Vance," Griselda said, her voice laced with quiet indignation. "The poor girl has spent the last 3 days locked in a damp holding cell in the county town, refusing to speak to anyone except her court-appointed solicitor. She insists she never sent those letters, yet Slack is treating her silence as a confession of guilt." "Silence, my dear Griselda, is frequently misinterpreted," Miss Marple observed softly, her pale blue eyes fixed on the grey yarn winding through her fingers. "People often mistake a terrified withdrawal for a guilty conscience. When an innocent person is confronted by an aggressive authority figure determined to build a neat and tidy case, retreating into oneself is often the only defense left." Before the vicar could reply, a sharp, urgent rapping echoed from the front hallway, followed immediately by the sound of the heavy oak door swinging open. Constable Higgins burst into the study without waiting for an invitation, his uniform cap slightly askew and his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Reverend, Mrs. Clement." "Thank goodness you're still here," Higgins blurted out, steadying himself against the doorframe with a trembling hand. He caught sight of Miss Marple and blinked rapidly, as though unsure whether an elderly knitting enthusiast belonged in the middle of a police briefing. It's the sexton, old Thomas. He's gone." The Reverend Clement stopped his pacing instantly. "Gone, Constable? What do you mean gone? Has he taken leave to visit family in the next parish?" "No, sir." Higgins swallowed hard, wiping his brow with a damp handkerchief. "We went down to his cottage by the churchyard about half an hour ago to verify his timeline regarding the belfry keys on Saturday. The front door was unlocked. His tea was still warm on the stove, but there was no sign of him. Instead, we found a ledger hidden under the floorboards, an old ledger bearing Arthur Pendleton's personal initials, filled with financial records from the Chelsea Art Gallery." Griselda sat up straight, her eyes widening in astonishment. "You mean Thomas had the missing documents all along? But I thought Evelyn Vance was the blackmailer." "That's just it, Mrs. Clement," Higgins said, his voice dropping to a nervous whisper. "The ledger contains detailed records of embezzlement, but the handwriting on the recent margin notes, the threats demanding hush money, doesn't match Evelyn Vance at all. And it doesn't match Thomas's shaky, uneducated scrawl either. It's written in a neat, professional hand, the kind of hand you'd expect from someone with medical training or formal clerical experience." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. A profound, absolute stillness settled over the room as she looked up from her work, her pale blue gaze meeting the young constable's terrified eyes. "How very extraordinary," Miss Marple murmured, her voice carrying a soft, melodic chill that seemed to lower the temperature in the study by several degrees. A ledger hidden beneath the floorboards, disappearing just as the investigation begins to narrow its focus. "Tell me, Constable Higgins, did you happen to find anything else in Thomas's cottage? Perhaps a garment of some kind? A scarf, or perhaps a cardigan of a particularly bright, cheerful color?" Higgins stared at her in stunned silence for a long moment, his jaw slackening. "Why, yes, miss. Dangling over the back of the kitchen chair, There was a bright yellow woolen cardigan. Looked almost brand new, though it was stained with dark grease around the cuffs. "How on earth did you—" Before Higgins could finish his question, a heavy, dull thud echoed from the direction of the churchyard, followed instantly by the sharp, frantic barking of the vicarage dog. The entire room froze. Reverend Clement bolted toward the front hallway, with Higgins and Griselda rushing close behind. Miss Marple rose more slowly, smoothing her tweed skirt with characteristic composure, though her eyes burned with the quiet, unyielding focus of a hunter closing in on her quarry. As they burst out onto the damp gravel path, the thick autumn fog parted just enough to reveal a chaotic scene near the lich gate. A figure was stumbling hurriedly away from the shadow of the vestry wall toward the open meadows, while another form lay crumpled near the iron gate. "Stop right there," Higgins roared, fumbling awkwardly for his whistle as he charged forward into the mist. Miss Marple stood quietly by the porch steps, her gray wool shawl draped securely across her shoulders. The mystery was no longer a tangled web of village gossip and conflicting theories. The true architect of the deception had finally revealed their hand, stepping directly into the trap that human nature, in all its flawed and desperate complexity, had inevitably laid. The damp autumn mist had settled heavily over the churchyard of St. Wine, Mary in the Vale, wrapping the ancient stone walls and gnarled oak trees in a silent, ghostly shroud. Inside the vicarage study, the atmosphere was charged with a palpable, breathless suspense. Constable Higgins had returned from his brief, fruitless chase across the meadows, panting and flustered, carrying a small leather-bound notebook he had retrieved from the grass near the lich gate. "The fellow vanished into the fog near the old mill," Higgins reported, wiping his forehead with a soot-stained handkerchief as he stood before the fireplace. "It's like he dissolved into thin air. But we found this notebook dropped near the gate. It's filled with financial calculations, medical dosages, and notes detailing Arthur Pendleton's daily routine down to the exact minute." Reverend Julian Clement took the notebook from the young constable's hands, turning the pages with a furrowed brow. "This handwriting, it is neat, precise, and entirely deliberate. It is the hand of someone accustomed to recording meticulous details, prescriptions, ledgers, formal records, medical dosages," Griselda repeated softly, looking up from the sofa with a sudden dawning realization. "Julian, who in this village maintains meticulous medical records and has complete freedom to move between the surgery, the church vestry, and the marquee without raising the slightest suspicion." All eyes slowly turned toward the corner of the room where Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her wicker armchair. Her knitting needles were resting in her lap, neatly tucked into a half-finished gray wool scarf. She did not look panicked, nor did she look surprised. Instead, she offered a gentle, serene smile, as though listening to a familiar movement in a well-loved symphony. "Human nature, my dear Griselda, is often most transparent when a person attempts to be extraordinarily clever," Miss Marple said softly, her voice cutting through the heavy silence of the study like a silver bell. "A murderer who relies solely on physical force leaves behind clumsy footprints and broken locks. But a murderer who relies on intellect, timing, and the quiet manipulation of other people's secrets always makes one fatal error. They underestimate the simple, observant nature of people who have nothing better to do than watch the world go by from a garden chair." Constable Higgins blinked, staring at the elderly woman in utter bewilderment. "Are you saying you know who dropped this notebook, Miss Marple? Who killed Arthur Pendleton?" "I know," Miss Marple replied mildly, picking up her gray wool once more, "that when a man like Dr. Carmichael takes extraordinary pains to establish an alibi, walking past the lich gate at precisely 2 minutes to 3, carrying an empty teacup filled with unadulterated black tea that belonged to a victim who preferred lemon and sugar, he is not merely absent-minded, he is choreographing an event." Reverend Clement drew a sharp breath. "Dr. Carmichael. But why, Jane? What possible motive could Edward Carmichael have for murdering Arthur Pendleton?" "Motive, my dear Reverend, is almost always rooted in fear or greed, and frequently a combination of both," Miss Marple explained, her needles resuming their steady, soothing click-clack. "5 years ago, before Arthur Pendleton retired to our quiet village, he was a central figure in a rather sordid art fraud syndicate in Chelsea. He kept meticulous records in a leather ledger, The very ledger old Thomas the sexton stumbled upon while cleaning out the crypt beneath the vestry last month. Thomas tried to blackmail Pendleton, Griselda whispered, piecing the puzzle together. Indeed, Miss Marple nodded gently. Poor Thomas, being rather simple and terribly short of funds for his rheumatism medicine, demanded a modest sum, but Pendleton refused. However, Thomas foolishly mentioned his discovery to someone else, someone he trusted, someone with the medical knowledge to know how a heavy bronze bell clapper could be manipulated from the belfry floor without leaving visible signs of a violent struggle. Constable Higgins swallowed hard, his hand tightening around his helmet. Dr. Carmichael. Dr. Carmichael, Miss Marple confirmed softly. Evelyn Vance was simply a convenient scapegoat, an art teacher with a past connection to the Chelsea Gallery whom the doctor cleverly framed by slipping forged correspondence into her desk drawer and planting a threatening note in the vestry wall. But the doctor made one microscopic error. In his haste to slip into the narrow coal cellar window of the belfry on Saturday afternoon, to strike Pendleton from behind with the heavy iron lever, a tiny shred of his bright, sunshine yellow merino wool cardigan, a garment he foolishly wore beneath his lab coat on chilly mornings, caught upon the rusted iron latch. The study door, which had been left slightly ajar to let in the cool evening air, suddenly creaked open. A shadow fell across the threshold. Dr. Edward Carmichael stood in the hallway, his face stark white against the gloom, his hands resting casually inside the pockets of his dark tweed overcoat. There was no medical bag in his hand, and his usual clinical composure had completely vanished, replaced by a cold, desperate rigidity. "A charming theory, Miss Marple," Dr. Carmichael said, his voice remarkably steady, though a faint tremor betrayed the muscles around his jaw. "Built entirely upon village gossip, stray threads, and the whimsical imaginations of an elderly spinster who has spent far too many decades prying into other people's private affairs." The room froze. Constable Higgins instinctively reached for his handcuffs, his boots shifting heavily against the floorboards, but a gentle gesture from Miss Marple halted him instantly. Miss Marple did not stand up. She simply looked across the room at the doctor, her pale blue eyes filled not with triumph or anger, but with a deep, profound sadness for the inherent frailties of the human heart. "Prying is such an ugly word, Doctor," Miss Marple murmured gently, her knitting needles pausing once more as she met his gaze unflinchingly. "I prefer to call it observation. Human beings are, after all, endlessly fascinating creatures. We try so very hard to bury our past mistakes, believing that if we hide them beneath enough layers of respectability, professional success, and quiet village routines, no one will ever notice the rot beneath the floorboards." Dr. Carmichael's eyes darted toward the open doorway behind him, then back to the sturdy figure of Constable Higgins blocking the exit. The veneer of calm cracked entirely, his shoulders slumping as the heavy weight of an inescapable reality finally settled upon his shoulders. "He was going to ruin everything," Dr. Carmichael whispered, his voice breaking into a harsh, ragged rasp as he stared at the floorboards. "Everything I built here, the practice, the respect of the parish, a clean slate. Pendleton found out I was the one who actually forged those paintings in Chelsea years ago, using his gallery as a front. When he moved to St. Mary Mead, he thought he could bleed me dry forever. He left me no choice." "There is always a choice, Doctor," Miss Marple said softly, her voice as gentle and sorrowful as an autumn breeze rustling through the churchyard leaves. "We simply choose the path that reflects our true nature. Some choose honesty, however painful. Others choose deception, until the very secrets they fought so desperately to conceal become the instruments of their own undoing." With a slow, defeated sigh, Dr. Carmichael withdrew his hands from his coat pockets and extended his wrists toward Constable Higgins, the heavy brass handcuffs gleaming coldly in the flickering firelight as the final shadow of the mystery was laid bare before the quiet parish of St. Mary Mead. The warm, dancing light of the vicarage hearth flickered across the walls of the study, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to echo the quiet solemnity of the room. Dr. Edward Carmichael stood motionless near the doorway, his wrists yielding passively to the heavy brass cuffs as Constable Higgins secured the clasp with a sharp, metallic click. The clinical detachment that had sustained the doctor through days of interrogation and feigned innocence had completely evaporated, leaving behind the hollow, exhausted shell of a man cornered by his own intricate deception. The Reverend Julian Clement broke the heavy silence, clearing his throat as he stepped forward with a troubled expression. "It is a profound tragedy, Edward. To think that years of honest medical service in this parish were built upon a foundation of such deep, calculated falsehood. Falsehood is remarkably easy to maintain, Reverend, when one is surrounded by people who only see what they wish to see," Dr. Carmichael replied, his voice flat, devoid of its former professional polish. He cast a brief, bitter glance toward Miss Jane Marple, who sat composed and quiet in her wicker armchair. "I never intended to harm Pendleton, not at first. But he came to St. Mary Mead with a malignant sense of entitlement. He expected me to finance his retirement indefinitely, threatening to expose my past involvement with the Chelsea forgery syndicate to the entire parish council. He left me no alternative. There is a vast difference between lacking alternatives and choosing the path of least resistance, Doctor," Miss Marple observed mildly, her pale blue eyes meeting his with an unshakable gentleness. She picked up her grey wool once more, her needles resuming their steady, rhythmic click. When a man decides that his reputation is worth more than a human life, he inevitably begins a descent that no amount of professional success can arrest. You calculated every detail of the Belfry tragedy, the timing of the parish bell, the use of the heavy iron lever from behind, the strategic deployment of an unadulterated teacup to create an unassailable alibi. You even went so far as to plant forged correspondence in poor Evelyn Vance's desk to ensure the authorities had a convenient scapegoat. Constable Higgins stared at the elderly woman in sheer astonishment, shaking his head. "It still boggles the mind, Miss Marple. If you hadn't spotted that tiny shred of sunshine yellow merino wool caught on the coal cellar latch, we might never have connected the doctor to the belfry at all." "Woolen garments, my dear constable, are terribly revealing," Miss Marple remarked with a soft, reminiscent smile. "People choose colors that reflect their inner disposition or their current mood. A bright, cheerful shade of daffodil yellow, worn beneath a somber doctor's coat, speaks volumes about a person who wishes to project absolute warmth while concealing a very cold, calculating mind. Furthermore, old Thomas the sexton was far too terrified of church authority to commit murder himself, but he was clumsy enough to leave the ledger hidden beneath his floorboards, where any observant visitor might find it." Griselda Clement stepped forward from the sofa, her arms crossed over her light cardigan, her expression a mix of lingering disbelief and profound sadness. "And poor Evelyn Vance. She has spent 3 damp, miserable days locked in a holding cell because of the doctor's elaborate frame-up. Evelyn Vance will be released within the hour, Mrs. Clement." Inspector Slack's voice boomed unexpectedly from the front hallway as he strode into the study, flanked by 2 local officers. The inspector looked somewhat subdued, his usual booming confidence tempered by the unmistakable realization that the quiet elderly lady in the wicker chair had solved a complex homicide right under his nose while he was busy interrogating an innocent art teacher. Slack cleared his throat awkwardly, adjusting his belt. "We've verified the alibi inconsistencies at the doctor's surgery. We found the remainder of the forged Chelsea correspondence hidden inside his medical ledger in the dispensary." Miss Marple nodded approvingly, her needles never missing a beat. "Inspector Slack is to be commended for his thoroughness in securing the physical evidence once the proper direction was indicated," she murmured with exquisite diplomatic grace, a touch that did not escape the burly inspector, who offered a stiff, appreciative nod in return. "Well," Inspector Slack said briskly, turning toward Dr. Carmichael with a return of his official authority. "The car is waiting outside, Doctor. We have a formal booking to complete at the county station, and I dare say the magistrate will have several pointed questions regarding your movements last Saturday afternoon." As the officers escorted Dr. Carmichael out into the damp, misty evening air, the heavy front door swung shut with a dull, final thud. The study seemed to exhale a collective breath, the tension of the past few days dissolving into a profound, reflective quiet. Reverend Clement walked over to the bay window, staring out into the darkening churchyard where the ancient stones of St. Mary in the Vale stood silent and enduring against the autumn fog. "It is difficult to comprehend, Jane, how human beings who live side by side, sharing tea, parish fetes, and quiet Sunday services, can harbor such dark, destructive currents beneath the surface of everyday life. Human nature is precisely the same everywhere, my dear Reverend. Miss Marple replied softly, folding her finished grey scarf neatly and placing it inside her wicker basket. Whether one lives in a bustling metropolis like London or a quiet, peaceful hamlet like St. Mary Mead, people are driven by the very same impulses: ambition, fear, jealousy, and the desperate desire to protect what they hold dear. The setting changes, of course, but the heart of man remains remarkably, stubbornly consistent. Griselda walked over, resting her affectionate hand on the older woman's shoulder. And yet, Jane, whenever a shadow falls across this village, you always seem to see straight through the dark. Miss Marple smiled, her pale blue eyes twinkling with a gentle, timeless warmth as she smoothed her tweed skirt and prepared for the short walk home. Oh, it is simply a matter of observation, my dear. If one spends enough time watching flowers grow in a garden, one quickly learns to recognize the weeds long before they choke the life out of the soil. By the following Monday morning, the autumn mist that had clung so persistently to St. Mary Mead finally lifted, replaced by a crisp, brilliant sunshine that washed the village green in a clear, golden light. Bunting had long since been cleared away from the parish fete grounds, and the heavy bronze bell in the tower of St. Mary in the Vial rang out with a deep, resonant, and entirely normal chime to mark the hour of 9. To any casual traveller passing through High Street on the morning bus, the hamlet appeared as serene, orderly, and delightfully uneventful as it had for centuries. Yet, beneath the polished surface of village life, an unmistakable air of quiet unease lingered. At the post office and the butcher's shop, residents spoke in hushed, reflective tones about the dark events of the past week. The arrest and confession of Dr. Edward Carmichael had sent shockwaves through every household, shattering the comforting illusion that quiet country villages were somehow immune to the darker impulses of human nature. Mrs. Price Ridley was frequently observed shaking her head over her morning groceries, remarking to anyone who would listen that she would never look at a local medical practitioner the same way again, while Mrs. Clitheroe noted with a shudder that one could never truly know what secrets were buried behind a neatly painted surgery door. Evelyn Vance had returned to her stone cottage by the Rectory Lane on Friday evening, greeted by a quiet delegation of neighbours bearing freshly baked scones, jars of plum preserves, and profuse, apologetic expressions. Though the ordeal had left her pale and understandably subdued, the warmth of the village's collective remorse gradually coaxed her back into her familiar routine. By Monday, the shuttered windows of her cottage were thrown wide open, and the faint, cheerful scent of linseed oil and turpentine once more drifted out into the lane as she prepared her canvas for the upcoming autumn art classes. At the vicarage, life had settled back into its traditional, measured rhythm, though the study bore the quiet echoes of a drama that had tested the parish's soul. The Reverend Julian Clement sat at his mahogany desk, thumbing through a parish register with a thoughtful expression, while his wife, Griselda, arranged a fresh bouquet of late-season asters in a ceramic vase by the bay window. "The village is remarkably quiet this morning, Julian," Griselda observed softly, stepping back to admire the purple and white blossoms against the light of the window. "The butcher's shop is buzzing, of course, but people are walking a little slower, speaking a little more gently. It is as though everyone is suddenly acutely aware of how thin the ice is beneath our feet." "Human nature has a way of resetting itself, Griselda, though rarely without leaving a few scars behind," the Reverend replied, closing the parish register with a quiet thud. He looked out across the lawn toward the churchyard where the old stone tower stood proudly against the pale blue sky. "I confess, I still find it difficult to reconcile Edward Carmichael's quiet dedication to the sick of this parish with the cold, calculated deception that led him to the belfry on Saturday afternoon." "People are wonderfully complex creatures, my dear," a gentle, familiar voice murmured from the doorway. Miss Jane Marple stood on the threshold, wearing her neat winter-weight tweed coat and carrying her wicker basket over her arm. She had just walked up the gravel path from High Street, her step as steady and unhurried as ever, her silver-rimmed spectacles catching the morning light. Griselda smiled warmly, stepping forward to relieve the older woman of her basket. "Jane, come in, come in. The kettle has just boiled. Do sit by the fire. The morning breeze off the meadows has a distinctly sharp edge to it today. Miss Marple gracefully accepted the wicker chair by the hearth, smoothing her dark skirt and settling her hands comfortably in her lap. "Thank you, my dear Griselda. A sharp breeze is entirely appropriate for mid-October. It reminds us that winter is approaching, and with it, the quiet necessity of putting our houses and our lives in proper order." Reverend Clement leaned back in his leather chair, studying the elderly woman with a mixture of affectionate amusement and profound respect. "And what of your own house, Jane? Now that the excitement has subsided and Dr. Carmichael is safely awaiting his trial at the county assizes, do you find the village peaceful enough once more?" "Peaceful, yes, Reverend. Though peace in St. Mary Mead has never meant an absence of human nature," Miss Marple replied mildly, taking the porcelain teacup Griselda handed her. She sipped the warm infusion thoughtfully before continuing. "People will always have their secrets, their long-buried scandals, and their desperate moments of folly. Inspector Slack is currently congratulating himself at the county station on having successfully closed a difficult homicide file, convinced that fingerprints, ledgers, and signed confessions are the ultimate proof of a well-solved mystery." "And you remain unconvinced by the inspector's triumphant conclusions?" Griselda asked with a knowing smile, sitting on the arm of the chintz sofa. "Inspector Slack is a most energetic and well-meaning gentleman," Miss Marple said charitably, her pale blue eyes twinkling with gentle humor. "He believes that crime is an extraordinary aberration, a sudden storm that breaks upon an otherwise cloudless sky. But life teaches us, if we pay sufficient attention to our neighbors, that storms do not simply appear from nowhere. They build slowly, drop by drop, from the tiny resentments, unspoken jealousies, and unaddressed vanities that people cultivate in their own backyards." She set her teacup down on the small mahogany table with a soft clink and reached into her basket, drawing out a half-finished length of grey wool and her trusty knitting needles. As the metal points began their familiar, soothing click-clack, a profound sense of tranquility settled over the vicarage study. Outside, the bells of St. Mary in the Vale chimed the half-hour across the sunlit rooftops of St. Mary Mead. The village had survived its brush with darkness. Its secrets were once more safely catalogued, its daily routines restored. And as Miss Marple serenely counted her stitches by the hearth, the quiet pulse of human nature beat on, steadfast, predictable, and endlessly fascinating, secure in the knowledge that nothing in this world ever truly changes. The silver chime of the church clock had barely faded across the rooftops of St. Mary Mead when a soft, hesitant knock fell upon the heavy oak door of the vicarage. It was nearly 11 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, a time when the village ordinarily slipped into a profound, somber quiet, broken only by the distant putter of the baker's delivery van or the occasional clip-clop of a farmer's cart rumbling down High Street. Inside the study, Reverend Julian Clement looked up from his sermon notes, while Griselda, who had been dusting the mahogany mantelpiece, paused with a feathered whisk in her hand. Before either could speak, the study door clicked open a fraction, and the gentle, weathered face of Miss Jane Marple peered into the room. Her expression was serene, yet carried that peculiar, sharpened attentiveness that always signaled her mind was actively knitting together loose ends that others had long since abandoned. "Do forgive me for interrupting your morning preparations, Julian," Griselda, Miss Marple murmured softly as she stepped into the room, her tweed coat neatly buttoned and her wicker basket looped over her arm. "I do hope I am not intruding upon your sermon drafting, but something rather extraordinary has just occurred down at the post office, and I felt it required a slightly more secluded venue for discussion." Griselda dropped her dusting whisk onto the nearest armchair with an eager clatter. "Oh, Jane, do tell us. Has Mrs. Price Ridley started another campaign about the village drainage, or has someone else been discovering mysterious ledgers under their floorboards?" "Nothing quite so dramatic as hidden ledgers, my dear Griselda," Miss Marple replied mildly, taking her customary seat by the hearth and smoothing her skirt with delicate precision. "Though human nature, as I so frequently observe, rarely leaves a vacuum for long. When one dark secret is brought out into the sunlight and neatly packed away into a police constable's dossier, another small domestic absurdity invariably rushes in to take its place." The Reverend Clement leaned back in his leather chair, a faint, weary smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Sit down, Jane, and pour yourself a cup of tea. Griselda was just complaining that the village had grown almost uncomfortably quiet since Dr. Carmichael's removal. What has rattled the peace at the post office this time? It is not merely the post office, Reverend, but the entire social hierarchy of High Street, Miss Marple explained, accepting the porcelain cup Griselda handed her with a gracious nod of thanks. It appears that the vacancy left by poor Dr. Carmichael's unfortunate departure has triggered a minor scramble among the county medical board. A temporary locum tenens has been appointed from the neighboring parish of Much Benham, a young man by the name of Dr. Arthur Pendleton II, or rather, no relation to our late lamented Mr. Pendleton at all, but rather a fresh graduate from St. Thomas's Hospital who arrived this morning in a very dusty Austin 7. Griselda burst into a bright, musical laugh. Surely not. Another Pendleton? In the very same village? If this keeps up, the parish council will have to pass a strict ordinance requiring all newcomers to adopt entirely fictitious surnames to avoid distressing Mrs. Price Ridley. Mrs. Price Ridley is already quite beside herself, Miss Marple agreed, taking a gentle sip of her tea. When the young doctor stopped to ask for directions to the surgery, she immediately assumed he was either an undercover detective investigating the late art syndicate or a secret relative come to claim the dead man's furniture. It took the combined efforts of the postmistress and the butcher to convince her that medical students do not customarily travel with forged oil paintings tucked under their armrests. Despite the light-hearted banter, a quiet seriousness soon settled over the vicarage study. The memory of the belfry tragedy, the heavy bronze bell, the sudden metallic thud, and the agonizing realization that a trusted pillar of the community had orchestrated a cold-blooded deception still cast a long, cooling shadow across the parish. "It is strange, isn't it?" the Reverend Clement murmured, gazing thoughtfully into the embers of the hearth. "We spend our lives building walls of respectability, convincing ourselves and others that our past mistakes are securely locked away in the crypts of our memories. Yet, as you have so often demonstrated, Jane, the human heart cannot forever keep its secrets buried. Sooner or later, the truth finds a way to ring out, often as jarringly as an unexpected note in a silent belfry. Truth, my dear Reverend, is not merely a legal conclusion or a confession extracted in a police holding cell," Miss Marple observed softly, her pale blue eyes reflecting the steady, unblinking light of the fire. "Truth is simply human nature stripped of its pretenses. People imagine that criminals are a distinct species, monsters wearing dark cloaks and operating in the dead of night. But true crime is almost always domestic, pedestrian, and terribly ordinary. It arises from the small, uncorrected flaws in everyday character. A touch too much pride, a sudden panic over financial ruin, or the terrifying conviction that one's social standing is worth more than a neighbor's life." Griselda leaned against the back of the sofa, watching the older woman with deep, affectionate admiration. "And yet, Jane, while Inspector Slack needed handcuffs, ledgers, and formal warrants to see the truth, you sat quietly under a beech tree with your knitting and saw right through the entire fabric from the very beginning." "Knitting, my dear Griselda, is a wonderful occupation for the mind," Miss Marple remarked with a gentle, disarming smile, lifting her needles from her basket as the metal points caught the morning light. "It teaches one patience. You watch the stitches grow one by one. You notice immediately if a single thread is out of place, or if a different color of wool has been surreptitiously woven into a pattern where it does not belong. Human communities are remarkably similar. If one simply watches the small, seemingly insignificant habits of people who walks too fast past the lich gate, who carries an unadulterated teacup when they prefer sugar, or who wears a bright, cheerful cardigan in a dark and dusty tower, the overall pattern becomes entirely clear. A comforting thought for the innocent, perhaps," Reverend Clement noted with a wry smile, "though a rather terrifying prospect for anyone in St. Mary Mead currently harboring a guilty secret." "Oh, honest people have nothing whatsoever to fear from observation, Reverend," Miss Marple replied mildly, her needles beginning their familiar, soothing rhythm, click-clack, click-clack. "Honesty is wonderfully straightforward. It requires no elaborate timetables, no forged correspondence, and no frantic incinerator sessions behind the garden shed. It simply goes about its business, trusting that the world is fundamentally sound, even if the occasional weed threatens to choke the garden." As the conversation drifted pleasantly towards simpler domestic matters, the upcoming church roof repairs, the prospects of Mrs. Clitheroe's winter preserves, and the arrival of the new medical locum, the village of St. Mary Mead continued its steady, unhurried march through the golden autumn morning. Outside the vicarage windows, the leaves of the old oak trees drifted slowly down upon the emerald turf, and the church bell chimed out the midday hour with a clear, resonant purity that brooked no argument. Miss Marple sat undisturbed by the hearth, her silver-rimmed spectacles glinting softly in the daylight, her mind already turning toward the quiet satisfaction of a completed row of grey wool. The shadow had passed, the village had returned to its customary equilibrium, and human nature, in all its complex, erratic, and endlessly fascinating variety, remained as utterly predictable and deeply beloved as ever. The golden light of late October had begun to fade across the rolling meadows of St. Mary Mead, casting long amber shadows that stretched lazily across the churchyard wall and touched the weathered stones of St. Mary, in the vale, with a soft, ethereal glow. It was a time of year when the village seemed to draw inward, wrapping itself in the comforting scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and fallen leaves, preparing for the quiet descent of the winter months. Inside the cozy study of the vicarage, the fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth, sending a steady wave of warmth across the Persian rug. The Reverend Julian Clement sat quietly in his leather armchair, turning the pages of a slim volume of poetry, while his wife, Griselda, was curled up on the chintz sofa, a book of local parish history resting unopened in her lap. The atmosphere was one of profound, hard-won peace, a stillness that felt all the more precious for the dark storm it had recently weathered. The heavy front door clicked open with a familiar, gentle sound, followed by the light, measured scrape of a sensible walking shoe upon the hallway tiles. Moments later, Miss Jane Marple stepped into the study, her dark tweed coat neatly unbuttoned, her woolen scarf draped loosely over her shoulders, and her wicker basket securely looped over her arm. Griselda brightened immediately, sitting up and swinging her legs to the floor. "Jane, do come in. The room is positively freezing compared to the hearth, and I was just telling Julian that we desperately needed someone with sensible judgment to settle a debate over whether the parish harvest supper should feature apple crumble or traditional plum tart. Apple crumble, my dear Griselda, is invariably the safer choice for large parish gatherings," Miss Marple replied with a mild, delightful smile as she stepped toward the fireside and gracefully accepted the chair offered by the vicar. Plum tarts, while wonderfully festive, have a lamentable tendency to be overly acidic if the fruit has not been allowed to ripen properly on the branch. Human nature, much like fruit, requires a certain amount of warmth and time to sweeten. Otherwise, one is left with a very bitter taste indeed. The Reverend Clement closed his book of poetry, laying it gently on the mahogany side table. A warm, welcoming smile touched his lips. "We were just speaking of you before you arrived, Jane." Griselda was remarking how remarkably quickly the village has settled back into its customary routine. Walking down High Street today, one would hardly suspect that less than a month ago we were the center of a county-wide homicide investigation. "Routines are wonderfully resilient things, Reverend," Miss Marple observed softly, settling her hands in her lap and pulling out a small ball of soft grey wool along with her trusty knitting needles. The familiar, comforting click-clack began almost immediately, setting a quiet rhythm to the room. People are creatures of habit. They prefer the comfort of the familiar to the unsettling disruption of a scandal. Once the police have packed away their notebooks and the county courts have taken over the formal proceedings, the village quite naturally retreats into its gardens, its tea parties, and its daily gossip, as though pulling a heavy wool quilt over a cold winter bed. "And yet," Griselda said thoughtfully, leaning forward with her chin resting in her hands, "nothing is quite the same, is it? Even if the shops are busy and the children are playing cricket on the green, there is an underlying sense that we have all looked behind the curtain, so to speak. We know now that even the quietest corners of St. Mary Mead are not entirely immune to darkness." "Darkness is never restricted by geography, my dear," Miss Marple murmured, her pale blue eyes reflecting the steady, unblinking flames of the fire. "People often imagine that evil is something exotic, something that wears a dramatic mask, speaks with a foreign accent, or dwells in the shadowed alleyways of a great metropolis. But true malice is almost always domestic. It grows quietly in the ordinary soil of human ego, jealousy and fear. Dr. Carmichael was not a monster from a Gothic novel. He was simply a man who allowed his fear of exposure to override his humanity, step by careful step, until he found himself standing in a dark belfry with an iron lever in his hand. The room fell into a thoughtful silence for a moment, save for the crackling of the logs and the steady, rhythmic clicking of the knitting needles. The tragedy of Arthur Pendleton and the fall of Dr. Carmichael had left an indelible mark upon the parish consciousness, a quiet reminder that the most respectable exteriors could sometimes conceal the most intricate deceptions. Yet, as Miss Marple's serene demeanor attested, understanding human nature did not mean surrendering to cynicism. Rather, it meant recognizing both the frailties and the quiet, enduring goodness that balanced the scales. "And how is Evelyn Vance settling back into her cottage?" the Reverend Clement asked gently, breaking the stillness. "I saw her walking past the Lyche Gate yesterday morning with her sketchpad under her arm, looking remarkably composed." "Evelyn is a sensible young woman," Miss Marple replied, with visible approval, her needles never missing a beat. "She has resumed her art classes with the children, and several neighbors have dropped by with flowers and polite apologies for their hasty judgments during her detention. Time, combined with a steady occupation, is the finest remedy for a bruised spirit. She will recover her equilibrium completely before the first frost arrives." "And what of Inspector Slack?" Griselda chuckled lightly. "Did he ever send word regarding the official closing of the case at the county assizes?" "Inspector Slack is currently devoting all his considerable energy to preparing an airtight prosecution brief for the forthcoming trial," Miss Marple said, with a faint, amused twinkle in her eye. "He remains firmly convinced that the entire resolution was achieved entirely through his own tireless pursuit of physical evidence, fingerprint ledgers, and formal warrants. I would not dream of disturbing his illusions, my dear Griselda. A happy police inspector is a very valuable asset to any county constabulary, and it would be positively unkind to remind him how much a pair of silver spectacles and a quiet afternoon under a beech tree contributed to his success." The Reverend Clement laughed softly, leaning back in his chair with a shake of his head. "You are remarkably charitable, Jane. Most amateur detectives would demand public recognition for solving a complex murder right under the nose of the county police." "Recognition is vastly overrated, Reverend," Miss Marple replied mildly, her grey wool steadily growing longer across her lap. "Public praise brings callers, and callers bring endless questions, and questions invariably interfere with one's gardening. No, true satisfaction comes from quiet observation, watching the puzzle pieces fall into their proper places and seeing order restored to a disordered world." As the clock on the mantelpiece chimed the arrival of 5 o'clock, the shadows outside the vicarage windows deepened into a velvety twilight, and the first evening star flickered into view above the ancient stone tower of St. Mary in the Vale. The village of St. Mary Mead was settling down for the night, its doors bolted against the autumn chill, its hearths burning bright and clear. Miss Marple neatly tied off her grey wool, snipping the thread with a small pair of silver-handled scissors, and folded her finished work with absolute precision before placing it back into her wicker basket. She rose with quiet grace, smoothing her dark tweed skirt and adjusting her shawl. "Must you go so soon, Jane?" Griselda asked, walking her toward the front hallway. "The kettle will be fresh for evening tea in just a moment." "Thank you, my dear, but the evening air is crisp, and my garden dahlias require a light protective covering before the night frost sets in," Miss Marple said with a warm, affectionate smile. "Besides, the world is remarkably orderly this evening, and it would never do to neglect one's garden while human nature is taking its quiet, predictable rest." With a gentle nod and a final, serene farewell, Miss Marple stepped out through the vicarage door and walked down the gravel pathway into the gathering dusk. Behind her, the warm lights of St. Mary Mead shone steadily through the windows, a peaceful English hamlet wrapped in the timeless rhythm of village life, where secrets might sleep for a season, but where an observant eye would always ensure that justice, quiet and absolute, was never very far away.